good academic career. He did his PhD in biochemistry from University of Delhi in 1978, and same year he went to US, and where he did an excellent academic work for 17 years. In 1996, he returned to India and joined MS University Baroda as a professor of biochemistry. In 1999, he joined Pharmaceutical Education and Research Development Center at Ahmedabad as director. And at this center, besides doing good research work and guiding many students for their PhD, he also started a very big government's project called NIPER. He was project director of that project. In 2010, he joined Sardar Patel University as a vice chancellor and served there for 2 terms. His research interests are in cell and molecular biology applied to health and pharmaceutical sciences. He has more than 200 research publications, and his work has been cited by more than 6,500 papers. His cumulative impact factor of his work is 300. H index is 40 at present, and I index is 90. He is member of several editorial boards and scientific societies, and he is also member of IBS committees of pharmaceutical companies to which he advises nowadays. With these few words, now I request Professor Harispad to start his talk, and I myself will go in the background and listen to his talk. Professor Harispad, please.
Hello and welcome from Ahmedabad for this third talk in the series of space biology. What I intend to do today is to discuss what happens to the human body when we go into the space or when we go on the other planets. And in order to do that, what we will discuss is take a broad overview of what our body is, how it works, and how it is influenced by several factors which are present on the Earth, and those factors which may not be present when we go out in the space. And those differences, how do they affect the functioning of our body, both biochemically, physiologically, as well as in our mind, in our orientation and cognitive functions. So in order to do that, this is the outline of my talk. In my first talk on 19th December, we introduced the subject of space biology. And as I told at that point in time, that there are 2 aspects of space biology. One is what happens to us when we go into the space, that is space conditions on our life. And the other is there other life elsewhere in the universe, what we call exobiology. So the second point we had examined in detail. Today, what we will do is discuss the other aspect of our life in the space. Now, we have been curious about the space, and when we didn't know much about of the space and the universe, we incorporated them as a heaven and other planets, and we placed our ancestors and our gods on those planets and on the solar system. But as our understanding increased over a period of time, We also became more ambitious, and we thought of ourselves going into the space. And that going into the space is actually not as trivial and as easy as we think. Besides the technological barrier of traveling the distances, there are also other barriers that affect our functioning. And what we intend to do today is, in a broader outline, discuss how the space conditions will affect us when we go out. What I generally do is I don't go into every detail oriented, very informative, information oriented discussion. What I intend to do is discuss the broader principles of how the space conditions will affect our functioning, and also discuss what we have learned so far. We have quite a substantial experience of being in the space, traveling in the space, and in that, what those experiences have taught us. Particularly at this juncture, this is very important because NASA is planning to send a manned mission to Mars. We have been to Moon quite some time back, but Moon is only about 400,000 kilometers away from us, while Mars is about 50 to 100 million kilometers away. So it's at least 200, 300 times as far as the Moon is. And while undertaking such mission, what should we be prepared for will be the focus of today's presentation. Briefly, our universe supposed to have started about 13.8 billion years back with a big bang. We all know about this. And the Earth's age now is approximately 4.5 billion years. And in that, the first living system out of non-living molecules developed on the Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. Uh, this is a timeline of what has happened on the Earth over a period of about 4.5 billion years. When the Earth was formed, as you can see this red line, there was no oxygen. The first living organisms developed around just after about 1 billion years, and then that life and the subsequently evolved life uh, became photosynthetic and developed a capability to split water into oxygen. And as this red line indicates, the oxygen started accumulating in the atmosphere. Now it is about 20%, which was almost 0% earlier. And because of this oxygen, most of the higher plants and animals that we see here have developed on the earth. This is the first vertebrate animal developed here, and human being, what we call Homo sapien, has developed about 1 million years ago. Now, as you can see, that life that I described, most of the living forms that we see around us have developed during this period. And there's a variety of life on this earth, mostly classified as a member of the 6 different kingdoms. Eubacteria are the bacteria as we know them. Some of us, we use them for fermentation and developing antibiotics, while others cause the diseases that we need to fight with. These archaebacteria are also bacteria, but they are expected to be a precursor of the eukaryotic cells, out of which develop what we call protista. These are the smaller unicellular organisms like amoeba, parasites, malarial parasites, etc. And then out of that, we have a plant kingdom, multicellular, eukaryotic, large vascular plants, animals of a variety of kind, and fungi. As of now, I think we are expected to have about 10 million species on the earth, while we have actually documented only about 1 million of them, and the others are yet to be discovered. One common element among all of this living form is that they are all made up of chemicals, very complex chemicals, and all their functioning is also because of the chemical reaction. Here you can see that there are a number of ecosystems on the earth. Each ecosystem has a population of living organisms, a variety of them, plants, animals, aquatic animals, and a variety of living organisms live in an ecosystem. Now, one individual organism has a number of organs, and these organs do a variety of different physiological functions. These organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells. This is the neuronal cells through which we sense, and we also command our muscles to do the tasks that we need to do. Each cell is made up of a number of subcellular particles. Here I am showing mitochondria. But all of these things are made up of a chemical. Mitochondria is an organelle which generates energy from the surrounding. So why I am telling you all this thing is that our body functioning, however complex it is, but it can be broken down into chemicals and chemical reactions. I'll give you a simple example, a heartbeat. We all have a heartbeat every second. And this heartbeat is nothing but a rhythmic cycling of about 200 chemical reactions occurring in our heart muscles. So you can imagine the complexity of the physiology. Some of the chemical reactions we may understand, some we may not understand, but they are all chemical reactions. For example, our memory. We don't understand how it really works, but there are chemical reactions, and these chemical reactions ultimately decide what we remember, how we retrieve the stored information, and how we orient ourselves, etc. Now, this beautiful life is developed, the complexity of physiological and biochemical reactions is developed because we have selectively accumulated, sequestered certain elements from the Earth's crust, and we have excluded some of them. These red elements, the hydrogen, carbon, oxygens, are quite rich in living forms, while the other elements in this graph, they are very rich in the Earth's crust, but living system have excluded them from their system. These cells, these molecules have a certain size. You start from here, 0.1 nanometer is the distance between carbon and carbon bond. A glucose molecule, C6 molecule, is about a nanometer in size. Hemoglobin, which is a complex protein, actually not that complex a protein, it's one of the proteins in our blood, which has about 7 to 8 nanometer size, ribosomes, and likewise. So all these biological structures have certain size dimensions. Now, the body as it is very dynamic. I'm able to talk to you through internet. Suppose I have to just leave this and run away because of fire or some incident. the body adjusts so quickly and so precisely that the things remain in homeostasis. And this homeostasis is important because there are a number of processes which are taking place at a certain pace, and the circumstances may demand that certain processes has to be enhanced. Like if I am running, more glucose is required, more oxygen is required to my muscles. Or if I had a lunch, then more blood supply is required to my intestine. So this kind of changes are part of the homeostatic system. And why I am emphasizing this thing is that when we go in space, some of these things are significantly altered. And we will see which processes are altered by what factor. But the point I want to make is that human anatomy is made up of about 200 cell types and many tissues. These 200 cell types give us the functions, what we call physiological functions, like digestion, the food that we digest and derive energy from this cardiovascular system, which circulates the blood, respiration, which is responsible for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange through hemoglobin with the outer air. Endocrinology is also a regulatory mechanism, hormones related. Reproduction. One I want to draw your attention is on the developmental biology and differentiation. I'll come in the next slide. And immunology and pathogen interactions, because the body looks like in equilibrium, but actually is continuously interacting with numerous invisible microorganisms. And these interactions sometimes give rise to immunity against them, and sometimes gives rise to the disease development. So a very complex physiological body system is because of all these chemicals and all the combination of chemical reactions we call a physiological process. And we will see how they are affected in the space conditions. Before that, I was telling you about differentiation and developmental biology. This body that we describe is developed from one cell we call a zygote. And this one cell is with the union of a sperm and egg, divides into so many cells, and ultimately it develops into a full body system. Now, this full body system has many cells. In case of human, it's about 10 raised to 13 cells, but they are all derived from one cell. And as they divide, they also differentiate. And some of them will become liver cells, some of them will become heart cells, some of them will become brain cells. And why I'm pointing it out here is that all of this process of differentiation and development, that program is written in a few cells which are located here. And these few cells, we call it stem cells. And the stem cells, because they have the master plan for the entire development of the body, the master plan for the sustaining this body for its lifespan, the master plan of how to fight with the infectious agent. So all of these things are contained in these few cells. And if these cells are altered when we go into the space, then you can imagine that the rest of the body plan and the functioning of the body will be altered. So these cells are becoming important. They also have a lot of medical applications. Earlier, I showed you uh, uh, physiological processes in a very beautiful body system. Now I'm showing you the biochemical system. Again, the body, which looks like a very well coordinated, made up of a number of tissues, have about this many cells, 10 raised to 13 cells. A 2-meter long DNA into each cell. and that has about 6 billion nitrogenous bases, which makes DNA. And ultimately, it boils down to about 30,000 genes and 30,000 proteins. And they make us what we are, structurally, functionally, psychologically, sociologically. In every aspect, a human being is a kind of outcome of the interactions of this many proteins and their biochemical reactions. These are some of the proteins. They have a very finite, very definite three-dimensional structure, as you can see here. These are some of the enzymes. This is insulin. And why I'm showing you this, that they have a lock and key kind of mechanism. So a particular 3D structure is required for it to be properly functioning. And if those structures are altered, then the function will be accordingly altered and may not carry out the functions properly. Gravitational force has an important role in getting them into the shape. As we will discuss subsequently, that some proteins can get into the 3D structure easily, while other proteins are very difficult to get them into the crystalline form. But in the space, it becomes much more easier because of no gravitational influence. Now, we realize that the life on the earth has developed because, not because of, but under the influence of the conditions prevalent on the earth. And these conditions have influenced the kind of life, the structure and functions of life that we see here. Out of that, gravity and radiation, gravitational force and radiations are two very critical factors which are significantly different in the space and on the other planets. While others, some of it we can mitigate, we can control, but are equally important. The importance of Earth's magnetic field on the life is underestimated. We have not really paid much attention to how the Earth's magnetic field affects the development and functioning of a human body. And certainly a circadian rhythm and the seasons are also influential in the functioning of a human body. Just incidentally, this may not be very critical to the space science, but I did not know when I read that the Earth's magnetic North Pole is moving, and it's moving at a very relatively high speed, about 50 kilometers per year. And it is moving from, this is a Canadian side and this is a Russian side, so it is moving in this direction. Now, what this movement of the North Pole, North magnetic pole of the Earth has on our navigations, our GPS systems, and military operations, we don't know much about it. But it may also have an effect on some of our physiological functions. And this report particularly said that recently, it was moving at a quite significant speed. That has been reduced to about 40 kilometers per year. But it is still a significant movement that we don't realize in our routine affairs. I think most of our experience of what happens to us when we go to space has come from two operations. One, when we went to moon. Second, when we established the International Space Station. This space station was started about 20 years back. It took about 10 years to fabricate it in the space. So it is a kind of assembly of various modules. And there is a continuous exchange of material and astronauts between Earth and the ISS. And I think as of now, there are about 60 missions which have gone to the International Space Station. This International Space Station is a kind of permanent platform in the Earth's orbit, and the exchange takes place by docking of a space mission, which goes and docks into one of the module here. And as you can see, this spacecraft is nicely docked, and through which this International Space Stations receives the experiments from the Earth, receives the material and the manpower. And generally, the astronauts stay there for about 6 months and then they come back. Now, as you can see, that it's a very collaborative project of five different countries and their space agencies. NASA from USA, Roscosmos from Russia, Japan's space agency, European Space Agency, and Canadian Space Agency. So these five countries have contributed technically as well as monetarily in establishing this space station, and it is at the orbit of about 254 miles. That's about 400 kilometers away from the Earth's surface. It travels at a very high speed, about 4.7 miles per second. And you can imagine that at that speed, if you have to dock a aircraft or the spacecraft, what kind of maneuvering and all is required in doing this. And if we are disoriented, if the astronauts are affected by the space conditions and they lose the orientations, you can imagine the consequences in this kind of operations. So it is about 50 meters by 110 meters long and width. And this is just like a football playground. And you can see that such large platform, which is there permanently, although I don't know how permanently it can stay there, but for the time being, it is a permanently placed in the orbit, and we do the experiments on this International Space Station from the Earth, sometime on the space station, sometimes the experiments are there, but controlled through on the Earth, and all sorts of permutations and combinations are possible. It weighs about 420,000 kilograms, which is approximately about 320 cars. This is the details of it. In essence, it is made up of many modules which are assembled over a period of 10 years. Even now, is a continuously remodeling of the space station takes place. And these stations belong to these five countries that I mentioned. Some of these modules, the lab are American or Canadian or Japanese, etc. But it's a good example of a collaborative project among five different countries and the space agencies. And it's a good endeavor by a human being to do joint projects, and it has worked very well. These are some of the details. It is powered by many solar panels, and this is a US lab, and likewise there are regions or modules specific to the country. Now, when we want to understand what happens to us when we go to space, one way is to just go into space and find out. Other way is to create some environment here on the Earth, and which in one aspect or other would simulate the conditions present on in the space, and then try to study what happens. I'm giving you three examples. a Yorkshire mine, which is a Bowley International Subsurface Astrobiological Laboratory in Yorkshire, which is located in one of the abandoned mines, which is about 1.1 kilometer under the sea level. And this is the UK's deepest microbiology laboratory. So about 1 kilometer subsurface, this laboratory has some conditions where the experiments can be done, simulating some of the conditions present in the space. The Martian surface is, or the Martian-like surface, is there in the Airbus Defence and Space in Stevenage, and these are used to train the vehicles, the rovers that we intend to use on the Mars. So these are the training surface for the rovers that will be eventually used to explore the Martian surface. Similarly, Antarctica, the dry valleys of Antarctica, for example, are considered an ideal analog for Mars. Astrobiologists have taken bacteria samples from this dry valley, subjected them to the environmental conditions that would be similar to those found on the surface of the Mars. So likewise, we can find surrogate situations on the Earth, and we can learn what happens to the living system under those specific conditions. This is an interesting example of how to simulate zero gravity. This is called a parabolic flight. Parabolic flight is nothing but a regular aircraft suited for this kind of experiments and the purpose. Now, what happens is that generally a flight, this is the Airbus 300, it flies around 600 meters, that is 6 kilometers level, and then it attains the altitude of about 8,500 meters. So this 2.5 kilometers altitude, it gains in about a minute's time, and its angle of I don't know what we call it, but this angle is about 45 to 47 degrees. And this takes place in about 25 seconds, and then another 25 seconds it is at this altitude of 8.5 kilometers. The speed here is about 650 kilometers, this is 390, and then it comes down at 650 kilometers per hour speed. During this period, only for about 25 seconds, the gravity is zero. So it's creating a microgravity situations. And if you examine what happens to a blood pressure and the ECG, you can see that almost instantly, as the zero gravity is attained here, almost instantly the heartbeat slows down. This is the ECG, the electrocardiogram. And you can see that there is a rapid heartbeat here, but it slows down here. And then once it comes back on this phase, it comes back to the earlier level. So almost instant changes in the ECG you can see when the human being are transported from 1.8 G to 0 G and for about 25 seconds or so. And then it comes back with a similar time frame. You see the blood pressure. The blood pressure, this is a delta between systolic and diastolic, so upper and lower blood pressures. And you can see that this blood pressure is not that high, but suddenly when it goes into a zero gravity, the blood pressure delta increases significantly, and then it comes back to normal when it attains the 1G situations here. So this kind of what we call it parabolic flight gives us a way of simulating zero gravity, but only for a very short period of time. When we go into the space, we have to face the microgravity kind of situations for a prolonged period of time. But this gives us some idea about the changes that we may expect. Incidentally, I'll tell you at the end that this is also used as a space tourism packet. We'll come to that later on. So now the mankind really faces a great challenge when we think about Mars. We have been on Moon and we have learned a lot about what happens when we go to Moon. But Moon is only about 400,000 kilometers away, while Mars is about 60 to 100 million kilometers, depending upon the position of both Earth and the Mars in the orbit. And that is couple of hundred times more distance. And it is expected that it will take about 6 months one-way trip to Mars. And if we understand the 6 months time, one has to prepare for various conditions, which will be very different in the space for the 6 months period. And while the Moon takes only about 4 or 5 days, this is about 6 months time. So I think it's a formidable challenge to prepare ourselves for such a long endurance. A history of who went to space when. Men first went in 1961 and the women in 63. But there were other animals like fruit fly, Drosophila in 47, 49, rhesus monkey, and a dog in 51, and some other animals followed men into the space. As of now, about 560 people have been into the space in the age group between 25 and 77. Now, what have we learned? Most of them have gone to the International Space Station, which is about 400 kilometers away from Earth's surface. And these 560 people have spent some time, although maximum is about 1 year, but most of them have spent about 6 months on the space station. And in that time, what we have learned. After all of this, compiling all these informations, I think the two factors, the gravity and radiations, are the two major factors which will affect the human physiology as well as psychology, and a lot of our activity and our well-being will be affected by these two, gravity and radiations. While the other conditions are important and they may induce some behavioral changes in the mankind. For example, long isolations. If we are talking about Mars, for 6 months being confined into a small capsule with 2 other colleagues, and that's a long durations, and that confinement and hostile conditions there can induce some of the behavioral issues that we have to face. And particularly if we expect these astronauts to do a very fine engineering maneuver while in the space, I think we have to be very about what it does to the human behavior on a long haul. So the NASA, keeping Mars mission in mind, have identified that this gravity field differences is one, and the space radiations is two. These are two significant issues. Along with that, the hostile and closed environment in the spacecraft, isolation and confinement, and a long distance from Earth are other three things that we have to worry about. What have we learned so far? So far, we have learned that these five factors significantly affects our physiology. I have tried to summarize some of them here. But as far as the gravity is concerned, if you are thinking about a mission to Mars, you will experience a weightless for about 6 months while you are going to Mars. Then once you are on Mars, the gravitational force will be about 1/3 of what we have on Earth. And when we come back, then we have to readapt on the Earth's gravitational force. This gravity also affects our spatial orientation, our head to eye and hand to eye coordination, affects balance, locomotion, and motion sickness. Very significant finding that astronauts lose the bone minerals, which is calcium and phosphate minerals in the bone, and the density drops about 1% per month while they are in the space, versus we lose about 1% per year in the elderly people. So you can see that it is an enhancement of bone loss at least 12, 15 times, and that remains almost permanent. It doesn't reverse back. So there's a greater risk of osteoporosis, fractures later on in the life when they come back. They may also lose muscle strength because you don't need much muscle power to do tasks in the microgravity circumstances. Endurance and experience cardiovascular deconditioning, since it does not take effort to float through the space. So even heart becomes a little bit of lazy because it doesn't have to work against the gravity to circulate the blood, and this may have a permanent long-term consequences. High pressure on your eyes because the fluid accumulates. The fluid, which generally with gravity will go downwards, will accumulate in the eyes, in the head, and that creates a vision problem. Kidney stones because of dehydration and increased excretion of calcium loss from the bones. And some of these conditions can be mitigated using right kind of medicines and right kind of nutrition. Now, if you are thinking about mission to Mars, it will take about 3 years mission. Because of the confinement and solitude, you will have a decline in mood, cognition, reduced morale, and interpersonal interactions. Sleep disorders. When we are on Mars, our day is about 38 minutes longer. So it adds about 38 minutes each day, and that messes up our circadian rhythm. Stress of prolonged isolation and confinement, depression to physiological and cognitive decline. So it is not good for mankind. Humans are not developed to remain confined in a small place for a prolonged period of time. The more confined and isolated humans are, the more likely they are to develop behavioral and cognitive conditions. When we are in a hostile small space along with 2-3 other people, the microbes will travel from one person to another person. Contaminations will be transferred will be more easily. Our stress hormone level goes up and immune system is adversely altered. Increased susceptibility to allergies and other illnesses and diseases. The significant factor is also radiations. Uh, on Mars, it is 10 times more radiation than Earth. Our atmosphere protects us from much of the radiations, but on Mars, there will be 10 times more radiations. Increased risk of cancer, damages nervous system, causes nausea, vomiting, anorexia, and fatigue, the kind of thing that we see in cancer patients who undergo radiation therapy. Degenerative and tissue diseases such as cataract, cardiac and circulatory disorders. And for Mars kind of mission, we need a significantly more protective and shielding environment for the astronauts. Now the distance from Mars is, as I said, many more times further away than the moon that we are used to. Communication delay of about 20 minutes. So if astronauts is undergoing this kind of physiological stress, and if he has to function a task, suppose there is a equipment failure, and 20 minutes communication gap with Earth would also put additional stress, and a key and very critical functioning may be compromised because of such a long distance. And I don't know what kind of food and medicine one should pack for a 3-year trip to Mars. The radiations, as you know, there are many types of radiations, particularly the electromagnetic radiations and ionizing radiations. These two types of radiations are common in the space conditions at much higher level than what we find on Earth. And what they do is they permanently damage the DNA. They breaks the DNA change, and that change can affect a lot of physiological and molecular functions. Uh, um, um, and those, some of these changes will be repaired, but some of them may not be repaired, and that leads to the formation of cancerous cells even after returning to the Earth. The kind of radiations, if you take a round trip to Mars, will be about 1.0. Now this unit is about 10,000 times more than you take a cross-Atlantic flight. So when you take a flight from USA to Europe, you receive certain additional radiations, but 10,000 times more radiations you will get if you have a round trip to Mars. It is about 100 times more than the whole body CT scan. So it is equivalent to 100 CT scans on the Earth, and approximately 10,000 X-rays. So, as you can see that the radiation risk is very high in the space, particularly in contact with the Mars, where the trip is going to be very long. What have we learned about what happens to our heart in the space? Effect of extraterrestrial environment on the cardiovascular system. The space flight removes the normal loading effect of gravity on the cardiovascular system and initiates aging-like deconditioning. In other words, the blood circulation has a certain effect of gravity. And if that gravity is reduced, then that has a very deleterious effect on the circulation system. Loss of physical fitness, arterial stiffening, and which is not reversible, and development of insulin resistance is what is found. This is taken from a recent review about 2 years back on the Nature's reviews on cardiology. Exposure to cosmic radiation during space travel might induce late cardiovascular disease. We don't know what is the threshold of these radiations, but higher radiations are inducing this kind of changes. And countermeasures to reduce the risk of space flight associated radiation induced cardiovascular disease include maintenance of physical fitness, dietary and nutritional intervention, and shielding from the radiation. Now, we have said a lot about what happens to our body and the physiological effects on the body, but it's also a mind game. As I said earlier, and then the solitariness, the confinement, all of these things for a long durations are not very conducive for man's best health and performance in cognitive aspects. Recently, an experiment was done on Antarctica. A number of individuals, about 9 individuals, were stationed in Antarctica for about 1 year. And in that 1 year, you can see that there is nothing. There is nothing. It's all ice, snow, and ice surrounded in this polar station. And for kilometers. So there's nothing except this site in the Antarctica. And those people who lived there for 1 year, their brain size shrank by about 7%. Now you can see that this is not space, this is Earth. But conditions of a very confinement into a very monotonous environment and reducing, shrinking of a brain by 7% is a significant effect that has been observed. So we have to worry not about what happens to heart and what happens to the bones, but we have to worry about psychologically and socially what happens to the human being in such a confinement. As I have mentioned earlier, that there have been many expeditions to the International Space Station, and as of now, there are about 60 expeditions, and every year there are about 3 to 5 expeditions planned. And what generally happens is that if astronauts go there, they stay there for 6 months or so, and then they come back after a couple of in the expeditions that is subsequently going there. Just to tell you that our experiments on the International Space Stations are not confined to only what happens to human, but we also use the other model system to study what happens to bacteria, what happens to plant, etc. Some examples here. On the 8th expeditions in October 2003, the study by European Space Agency looked at how we carry microorganisms in the space, how they survive, adapt, and multiply on the ISS, and where they grow most easily. In Expedition 9 in next year, that is 2004, we germinated the seeds on the ISS, and the germination and development of plant and the effect of light on these things were studied. This is interesting things that certain vaccines for HIV and AIDS, we were able to develop in the space because these proteins, which are required in a particular configurations, conformation, we could develop it easily in the space because of microgravity situations. So even this crystallization of these antigens gave rise to a better vaccines for HIV and AIDS. And likewise, one experiment by Japanese agency was what happens to the radiation on the sperm. So they carried some mouse sperms to the space station, exposed them to the radiations over there, and brought it back to the ground, and they see the fertilization capability of these sperms on the earth. So a variety of experiments are carried out in these expeditions, and totally we are trying to learn what happens to biological system, not only human, but what happens to a biological system in this space. A very interesting study was done recently in 2015-16 by NASA. It has been said and it has been debated over a period of time that a man is a outcome of nature and a nurture. Nature is the genetics and nurture is the environmental conditions. So what one is today is because of the nature, that is genetic contributions from his or her parents, and the environment. And environment means food habits, lifestyles, and many things together. Now, if you want to study the effect of environment, then you have to keep your other variable constant. Now, genetics cannot be kept constant between two individuals. So you cannot comfortably compare one person with another person's, but you can compare them if they have an identical genetic background. And that identical genetic background is present only in the identical twins. So NASA had these two brothers. They both were trained astronauts, but they did a year-long experiments that one of the two brothers, they kept him on the Earth, and the other one was sent to ISS space station for 1 year, almost 1 year. And what they did was they did a thorough study of various systems between these two individuals. Remember, the genetic background is very similar. But what is variable is that this person was exposed to space conditions for over a period of time. And what you can see is that the variety of studies have revealed many interesting observations. The one is that telomeres, which is responsible for controlling cell division, they get longer in the space flight. Decrease body mass and increase folate level in the orbit. Mentally fit in the space. So as long as the other person was in the space, there was no problem. But when he came back to Earth, he was foggy when back on the Earth. One good thing is that the flu vaccine worked equally well in the space as well as on the Earth. There was some inflammatory increase while in inflammation increases while in the space. One important thing is that we harbor a lot of bacteria in our intestine, in our gut. We call it microbiome. Roughly you and I would have 1 kilogram of bacteria in our intestine. And these bacteria are of variety of kind and maybe hundreds and thousands of kinds. And that population of a variety of organisms does change when one goes to the space. But fortunately, when one comes back, it returns to whatever the microbiome was there. Now, microbiome or this microbial population in our gut is responsible for, in many ways, responsible for keeping us healthy or developing certain disorders linked with development of certain disorders. So it was significantly affected while in space. Space flight because of radiation can trigger gene mutations, also expression of the genes changes. Arterial wall thickening happens in space, and this is irreversible. So one risk being higher prone to arterial diseases even after returning to Earth. Proteins that regulate fluid increases while in space. So from this study, what conclusions has been drawn is that there are some responses which are observed, but they return to the pre-flight level. So once the astronaut comes back, then they're coming back to the same level. Immune response, epigenetic changes, gut bacteria, body weight, and some of the serum metabolite. So this is not much of a problem because it does return when the person came back after almost a year in this space. Some effects are seen only after landing back on the Earth. For example, inflammation and some of the immune response. So this is something that one has to worry about. That if the astronauts are coming back, then we expect some of these changes. And more worrisome are that they remain altered even 6 months after coming back to Earth. So when one spends 1 year in the space and comes back, even after 6 months, these changes are still visible. And there are small subset of changes in gene expression. So what proteins are made and what are not made, telomere dynamics, DNA disruption, carotid artery thickening, so heart disease related, eye changes, and some of the cognitive functions. So this twin study has taught a number of important, and it's a unique study because we don't have many such identical pairs where we can keep the genetic background common and see the effect of space on the individual's functioning. There are some long-term issues that we should think about, need not worry about, but think about. That when we migrate beyond Earth, and if we take some other species along with us, now that evolution might be different because the factors responsible for evolution on the Earth are very different than on the other planets or in the space. So these mutations and speciations, are we obligated to keep this thing unaltered? And what happens if they are altered over a period of time? This is a long-term ethical, you may call it philosophical issues, but that's an issue that should we get involved in the evolution process. And unknowingly, this will happen if we go and establish a habitat on some other planet eventually. And the astrobiology also offers some of such ethical issues that we have to think about, the long-term things. Now, many people ask, why are we spending so much money? What is the benefit of all these things except our curiosity to explore the solar system and other galaxies? I will give you some examples that our work in space has also helped us in making life little better on the Earth. For example, number of satellites, they monitor the situation on the Earth. And these watchful eyes of the satellites tell us, detect the forest fire, migrating endangered species. They also tell us the changing dynamics in ice sheets, expanding urban sprawl and shrinking rainforest, air pollution. In the wake of national disaster, the satellites help us to know where and to what extent the damage is being done. Epidemiological, the disease spread can also be monitored through this type of satellites that we have been using in the space science. And the range of measurements about carbon dioxide levels in the ocean circulation, acidification of the oceans, all of such monitoring eventually helps the simplest is the weather satellite. And it tells us about the incoming storm, incoming tornado, not tornado, but incoming other major geological phenomenon. Some innovations developed for the space or have also helped us in many ways. For example, how the pathogen behaves in microgravity has helped us to understand how to control the pathogens on the Earth, how to develop how to mitigate such pathogens' behavior so that the diseases can be controlled. As I told you that microgravity helps in the crystallization of certain proteins, and salmonella is changing the virulence because of the earth, and understanding that helps us to control salmonella. Osteoporosis, which happens in astronauts but also happens in elderly, so how to mitigate that we can learn from each other. Very sophisticated robotics are used on International Space Station, and such robotics are also now used for surgery at remote places where it may not be possible for surgeon to be physically present there. Sensors which are to be used on and which have been used on Mars for sniffing life have also been converted into an insulin pump that diabetic patients can use, as shown here. And image analysis and pattern recognition that we've learned a lot from this, and now we use in a variety of different ways on the Earth. Finally, it's not only the curiosity and the scientific community which is interested in space. Certain entrepreneurs are also interested in capitalizing on space tourism, and commercial travel to the space is on the horizon. That there are a number of companies which are planning or which are exploring this idea of taking human in the space for fun, as a tourism, as an experience. And some example that if there is an empty seat in the spacecraft which is going to International Space Station, those can be given, has been given to a private, and the cost for that thing is out-of-pocket cost is about 15 million, where you can spend about 1 month in the space station. There are some suborbital space travel that is about 80 kilometers from the Earth's surface. 2.5 hours ride may cost you about $250,000. And the parabolic flight that I told you about, the flight may not be of the duration of more than hour or hour and a half, but in which you will experience the 25 seconds of zero gravity. And that may cost you about $5,000 if you want to have a one seat on that flight, or if you want to have some function or some party or some destination marriage, for example, you can book the flight for about $180,000. So I think the space tourism sector will expand. May not be to the level of ISS, but some such short exposure, and there also we need to learn how to prepare, what kind of physiological and mental condition the travelers, the tourists should be in order to undertake such experience. Finally, as you can see, that our integrated knowledge, where we learn from many disciplines, and we develop our overall understanding in the various and different areas. Space biology has also become an established, prominent area where understanding ourselves and understanding what happens to us when we go into the space will ultimately help us in our overall understanding of our universe, and hopefully we may also be looking for another place for mankind to go and establish a colony there. And for right or wrong, I think this technology will be around us. So I will conclude by making few points that I have made in this presentation. That man has certainly stepped out of Earth into space, no doubt about it. First to the moon and subsequently to the International Space Station has provided experience of life in the space. Gravity or lack of it isolation, confinement, hostility, hostile and closed environment, radiation, distance from Earth. These are all factors which significantly affect human behavior as well as human physiology and functioning. They affect most of the human physiological system, and some of them may be reversible, but some changes like bone density changes, thickening of the heart arteries are not reversed easily. Some changes can be mitigated through exercise, proper nutrition, training, and medications, while others may not be. Long-term space travel is a formidable challenge, and Mars and subsequently to other places, if we think of, I think we have to learn about these challenges, and we have learned how to protect and mitigate some changes that take place in the long space travel. In a limited way, the commercial space tourism has also become reality. And hopefully, Homo sapiens, that is a man, human, may establish home away from home, either for pleasure or for a variety, or if we run out of resources on the earth, or if we are fed up with the system, the politics, and other things on the earth, we may have a home somewhere else. And hopefully, that home will not have as many created problems as we have here on the earth. This is a resource that one can look at. This resource has all the missions in the space listed chronologically, and what their missions were, what they accomplished, and all the specification of every mission is listed there. I'm thankful to the Space Education and Research Foundation of Ahmedabad for this opportunity. I have indeed learned a lot in this exercise. I also thank many contributors from whom I have taken some of the pictures that I have presented and the websites. And thankful to my friends and colleagues for always having a stimulating discussion, especially my students. And finally, I end with this quotation that recall the face of poorest and the weakest man you have ever seen. Ask yourself if this step you contemplate is going to be any use to them. And that is true for all our endeavors, including science and space. So we should be thankful for being on this beautiful planet Earth at this point in time, where we have understood much more than our ancestors about what this Earth is, what this space, what the universe is, what the galaxies are, and ultimately what this universe is. And we have also learned how to make the best out of it, the challenges that we have learned about and kind of tried to conquer. So we are grateful to this great planet on which we are here at this moment. I thank each and every one of you for being for attending this webinar. And with that, I will stop here and hand over to Dr. Watts for further deliberations.